So I thought we'd kind of start out talking about the Trump presidency, just to don't not necessarily a number, but how would you kind of gauge or rate the Trump presidency?
It's a total one. Um, no, I mean, that's one of those questions where it depends where you're standing, right?
Yeah.
So I think that actually, if I was a Republican, I would give it a 7 or an 8.
Right.
Uh, Major redistribution of wealth, even more significantly to the top, staffing up the judiciary with the most, I mean, even by the standards of Reagan and Bush, the next acceleration of far right extremist ideologues on the benches.
Mhm.
Executive orders rolling back things on everything from overseas corruption practices to making it easier to torture animals, pollute the environment.
Yeah.
This is the perfect Republican agenda.
Right.
Not to mention dropping the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan and,
Yeah.
God knows whatever else is going on in terms of national security state, higher civilian casualties. If I'm a Republican, I would be thrilled.
Right.
Um, so I think, obviously they failed on Obamacare repeal, but they kind of there was some of that in the tax bill.
Right.
Um, I mean, outside of it, I don't know, man. I guess it's kind of like what you'd expect. I mean, the guy's super unstable, and the Republican agenda is not popular with most people. So the
Right.
question really becomes, first of all, that obviously structurally, where there's capital, there's power. So that part, basically the corporate interests obviously have like they have the most power of anybody in society,
Mhm.
and these things are their agenda. And then, the Democratic brand has sucked for a
Right.
really long time.
Right.
Except for a couple of really charismatic leaders, basically.
Yeah.
And that fight in the Democratic Party is happening. I think there's a little bit of progress on that. But if I was a Republican, I mean, I think it's kind of obvious. I guess if you're left, of course, it's terrible.
Right.
And objectively, you know, it's a total mess and shambolic. But
Yeah.
actually, they get a lot of stuff done, and it's the Republican agenda. It's not a Trump agenda, and
Right.
the Republican agenda is just objectively terrible for basically everybody. And like, unless you're on a private jet to see Conor McGregor and Mayweather fight each other, you
Yeah.
shouldn't like what they're doing.
That's true. Um,
Yeah.
so to kind of build off that, I was curious what your thoughts are on the upcoming 2018 midterms. Do you think that the Democrats will really be able to win back significant seats? I mean, what do you think's really going to happen there?
I think Democrat. I mean, yeah, I think Democrats will win the House.
Do you think
I
so?
do. I think so. I think they'll win the House, the
What about the
Senate.
Senate?
I don't think they'll win the Senate, but I think that they'll probably overperform. And then so it's important in a cycle like this, even that a terrible Democrat is better than a Republican,
Right.
and that's just the truth. But then the really interesting part does become, uh, the internal war
Right.
inside between the corporate Democrats and more left Democrats, however we want to define it.
Yeah.
So, and in some of these races, especially ones where there's a candidate who's, you know, bucking the DCCC,
Mhm.
there's actually some pretty good candidates out there.
Yeah.
Um, and so that becomes an interesting question. And I'm trying to also on a local level, I'm having on a lot of like DSA,
Mhm.
socialist candidates, that type of thing. But even a guy like Dan Cannon in Indiana, I mean, I'm well to the left of him, but the dude accepted the DSA's endorsement. He's campaigning on abolishing ICE. He's a
Mhm.
civil rights attorney. That's a legit candidate. So that's going to be interesting. But I do think that I think they'll perform well, but I think that Republicans also can see that too, and you know, there'll be Republican turnout too, no doubt.
Yeah. So I was wondering if did you hear about like the recording that one of the
Standing for it.
yeah, the Steny Hoyer thing,
Yeah.
And personally, that got me really angry because really what he said, it was pretty like crystal clear as to what was going on. And I was just curious as to how we can move forward to try to take over the Democratic Party or to get more progressives in the party or have more progressive representation if literally every election cycle they're going to be cheating us every time.
Well, I mean, here's my thing is I think it's already like happening, right? Like they're not necessarily winning in those primaries where they have their thumb on the scale. And if anything, like if I was the whoever the DCCC hack candidate,
Hmm.
Steny Hoyer was not helping them by running his mouth
He
in the
definitely
bar like
wasn't
that.
doing that, but like
Yeah,
with all the stuff
well,
that they were doing though, I mean it's hard to
yeah,
combat the DCCC machine.
I don't know about that. There's a lot
Really?
of money you can raise outside of it. And at this point, if I was running for Congress, would I want the support of the new base, grassroots, independent media, excited, motivated people running a no bullshit Medicare for all, you know, universal housing, job guarantee, calling out war crimes in Yemen, talking even about, I want to see people talking about what's happening to Lula in Brazil, all, being clear on policing and have the people come behind me, or would I want the same failed consultants that have been recycling themselves through the DNC for ages
Well, let's say it's not the
running the same
consultants, but rather because I think that the most
so
effective thing they do is just media coverage and just giving them a shitload of money that just basically there's no way to really combat that.
but I mean, we're combating it every day, man. I mean, the thing is like their fundraising totals in the DCCC are not that great right now, especially relative to how well everything else is going. So I guess it's like, I mean, I'm not saying it's good, but I think it's definitely not futile. And if we say it's futile, then it's futile. You know what I mean? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The other thing too is the other difference I would make is that I don't actually I have a problem with what the DCCC is putting its thumb on the scale for, not that they're putting their thumb on the scale. You know what I'm saying? If we were in control of the party and some guy was having a drink with me, well, I wouldn't be dumb enough, hopefully, to be that blunt on tape. But if the dude was like, why don't you get behind me? I would say, well, because we support candidates that support Medicare for all. We support candidates that know we need to radically raise taxes on the wealthiest people and redistribute it in everything from healthcare to education to housing to infrastructure. And you're a former, Goldman Sachs lawyer, let's say,
Hmm.
and you're talking about, a little bit of an Obamacare bill. That's not what we support. So I feel like that's the other thing too, is I don't really, if the DCCC was putting its thumb on the scale in the right way, that would be cool.
Oh, so you'd be
You know
okay
what
with
I'm saying?
that? You don't want to have like a
Absolutely.
fair election?
Well, I mean, I guess it's like there is a fair election. I mean, people vote. They
Well,
go
yeah,
out.
no, they vote, but I mean, it's like basically if the DCCC is putting their machine behind someone, the person is running two campaigns essentially because they have two opponents now, and obviously it's difficult to combat that, the DCCC machine. You know what I mean?
I don't
So
think if you were running for Congress
yeah.
right now in a district with some progressive voters, would you pick to have um, an independent, powerful base and endorsement of groups like Our Revolution, or Steny Hoyer maybe writing you some checks and having some bad consultants?
Well,
Which
so
would you pick?
I'd
Which would you?
rather I'd rather have the independent progressives, but
Mhm.
when my opponent is getting the aid from the DCCC, it's like there's no way to really you can't really defeat that because in
Well,
those
that's not.
areas it's like
I don't know. Laura Mosier just did. That's why they're in a. I'm not trying to be too difficult with you, man. But it's not. That's just not how it's playing.
so you
You know
don't
what I
really
mean?
think it's that big of a problem.
I think it's a problem, but I don't think. I think you got to just keep doing what you're doing. You know what I mean? Like I don't. I guess when people say like, "Oh, there's nothing we could do about it," then it's like, well, all right. So go watch the NBA playoffs. You know, cool. All right. First of all, I don't agree. There's a lot we could do about it, and there's a lot of momentum on the right side of it. And number two, I don't think the DCCC is not as powerful as people think it is. If it was as powerful as people think it is, then we wouldn't, then they wouldn't be embarrassing themselves and shooting themselves in the foot every other day and having intercept pieces come out embarrassing them constantly and have candidates that are on the right side of it with momentum. Also, I think there's a difference. Like, I would say, yes, if I ran the DCCC, I would say we only want candidates that are actually left, and that is who we're going to support, is different than trying to smear a candidate like they did with Laura Mosier. That's a whole different thing. And that was also so sloppy and so stupid that it ended up hurting them and helping her. You
Okay.
know,
So, this will kind of lead into, I guess, the 2020 election. I mean, what are your thoughts on 2020 prospects? Who would you like to see run? What do you think is going to happen?
it's early, man.
It is.
I mean, I think from the perspective of my politics, as a as really as like a democratic socialist. I mean, Bernie is still he's the only game in town,
Yeah.
and I'm glad that other people are catching up. It's really good to see. Like, some people get all like, oh, they're lying. Like, Kamala Harris doesn't really support Medicare for all or whatever, but that shit doesn't. That's irrelevant. The point is he's moved the dial to they have to follow him, which is a great thing. But
Yeah.
if you're still asking me in terms of like who is, it's, and now that he's starting to talk about foreign policy and he's talking about, the Israeli killings in Gaza, the
Yeah.
occupation, he's talking about, he did that. The only other guy actually is doing anything on foreign policy right now is actually Chris Murphy. But Murphy's got nothing on Wall Street or healthcare. So at the end of the day, it's just like all of the biggest issues: global warming, you know, inequality, finance, everybody getting health care. And also, I would say increasingly you're going to see him on race and policing issues, but those things are also impacted by the other things that he talks about.
Yeah.
Getting labor unions back going again. I mean, who else? Elizabeth Warren's got some cool shit. I don't I don't hate these other. I don't hate like centrists, like the way some people get all freaked out about them. But like, come on, I'm gonna go into a voting booth and vote for fucking, you know, I don't know, Gillibrand over Bernie Sanders.